The text says that the 12 sons of Jacob, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, had grown to a tremendous population of about 600,000 men. If this were true, when you add in women and children, it would likely mean a total population of over 2 million. Many find it hard to imagine this many people crossing the wilderness. This is why most in the Egyptian group favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. It has to do with the Hebrew word Aleph. Dr. Bryant Wood is the former director of ABR, and he favors the Egyptian approach.
This matter of numbers, large numbers in the Old Testament, is a very, very thorny issue. But I think clearly it has to do with our understanding of the Hebrew word Aleph, which is translated 1,000.
So if it says 650 Alephs, then that would mean 650,000.
If you take Aleph to mean 1,000.
Right.
I believe that in these early accounts that it must have another meaning. We find, in fact, that there are some places in the Old Testament where it's translated chief, it's translated clan. I like the translation unit better. One scholar who looked at this recently is Colin Humphreys in England, and he concluded that it was about 20,000 people total that left Egypt. And I think that's a reasonable figure. And of course, if you use the translation of 1,000 for Aleph, you come up with 600,000 men, which would mean, several million Israelites leaving Egypt. And I think that's an impossibly large number.
Most scholars I've interviewed in my investigation favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. And I have to admit, this is part of the story that I've struggled with the most. How could so many have survived in the wilderness?
What people are wanting to do is narrow this language of Aleph in the census list, which are only about the military men, 20 and over, narrow that to mean a military company, a military grouping. But if we do that, we end up with very, very small Israelite population. What's clear in the biblical text is that there has to be enough Israelites in order to make Pharaoh and the rest of Egypt scared. Exodus chapter 1. That they were multiplying in such great ways, thus being faithful to God's promise, and bringing fear to the Egyptian army.
If the Israelite population had grown like it's written, then it would have been a fantastic miracle, and it would have been just what God had promised Abraham, that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky on their way to inheriting the promised land. This is in line with the Hebrew approach. There are several places where Moses uses the Hebrew word Aleph that indicate it was operating with the normal meaning of 1,000. For instance, in the book of Exodus, Moses tells about an offering taken at Mount Sinai.
Each man from 20 years old and upward was to contribute a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel. The rich could not give more, and the poor could not give less. And the number of half shekels collected came to 603,550.
Then there was the census taken at Mount Sinai.
God told Moses, "Take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clan, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male, head by head." Each tribe listed their numbers, and the total of the 12 tribes was 603,550.
When the numbers for each tribe in the census are translated with Aleph meaning 1,000, they add up as expected. How then do those in the Egyptian approach come up with smaller numbers for this census?
You always have a 1,000 figure followed by a number. The word for 1,000 has more than one meaning. In the Bible, it has more than one meaning. If you take those groups, instead of saying 54,400, you would say 54 clans or families totaling 400 people. 62 clans totaling 700 people, and so forth. Then instead of having 603,550, you would have 598 groups totaling 5,550 people.
I could see that if you add up the census numbers using the meaning of clan for Aleph rather than thousand, it does not match what the Bible references. And totaling up the hundreds column does not add up either. Is the fact that these numbers are adding up perfectly when translating Aleph as thousand just a coincidence? You know, a lot of people have a really difficult time that there were millions of people going out. They think, well, how could that many people exist in the wilderness?
Sure, but in even raising that question regarding their existence in the wilderness, it fails to account for the text itself, which says miracles were happening over and over again. Miracles of manna from heaven, water from a rock. God didn't let their sandals wear out. A single pair of shoes for 40 years. Good night. It's a miracle.
Yet Dr. Beitzel stresses that taking Aleph to mean clan rather than thousand would not be changing the wording of the Bible.
If you were to divide up the word Aleph in that way, you're not changing one vowel point, you're not changing one letter in the Hebrew Bible. You're just taking Aleph in a non-numerical sense rather than in a numerical sense. I'm not saying that this is an explanation that lies beyond questions. But I am saying to you that in my view, this is the most cogent alternative view. It doesn't answer all the questions.
Right.
If it answered all the questions, we wouldn't be sitting here even discussing it.
We wouldn't.
Again, if we have a view that God is big and that Scripture is true, it demands that we understand He's able to sustain millions for 40 years through wilderness.
So how does the traditional Sinai measure up to these criteria?
How are you going to prove it? How are we going to prove it? Well, you're not going to find parts of the Ten Commandments on any of these mountains. I do know that in front of what is traditionally Mount Sinai, there's a large plain called the Plain of Raha, which we have wonderful drawings by Roberts in the 1850s, where you could have thousands of people standing there. I know of no other place in Sinai that can replicate that the two conditions, tall mountain and a plain in front of it. In Midian, I don't know the answer.
Well, I've heard suggestions that there just isn't enough room for an encampment at the traditional Mount Sinai.
Absolutely not true. This is a massive plain, they call the Raha Plain. It's huge. St. Catherine's Monastery is just here. And this is a very, very broad, sandy plain where a massive camp could be set up, a huge camp.
When the children of Israel left Egypt, there were 600,000 men of military age, plus their families. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and great numbers of livestock, flocks, and herds.
The Egyptian approach doesn't believe the Bible was meaning 600,000 men, but rather 600 groups. So I need to visualize the Israelite population along with the camping areas available at all the proposed mountains. If each Israelite family of 10 is assigned a 40 by 40 foot space, then a group of 1,000 would occupy a square about the size of 3 football fields. The Egyptian approach typically estimates the Israelite population at between 5 and 30,000. The space available at the traditional mountain could easily have accommodated this number. However, the Hebrew approach believes that there were at least 2 to 3 million Israelites. If that were the case, they would not have had the room to camp there.
Moses commanded the Israelites to wash their clothes in preparation to meeting God.